All right, we're going to talk about the Labour Party. Richard, you've said the disastrous election defeat of your party wasn't about Jeremy Corbyn, it was about Brexit.
Well, the reason I say that is because in 2017, with the same leader, the same Shadow Chancellor, the same Shadow Home Secretary, and a similar Socialist manifesto, we made an electoral advance. We got 3 million extra votes and extra seats. Fast forward 2 years later, with the same leader, same Shadow Chancellor, same Shadow Home Secretary, similar Socialist manifesto, we had a dreadful night, lost 2.5 million votes, and lost fantastic colleagues. The difference between 2017 and 2019 is it became the Brexit election, and the issue of Brexit overshadowed traditional party loyalties.
All right, well, let's investigate that and see what voters had to say in Stoke, where Labour lost 3 of its seats. Here's Greg Dawson.
This is one of many parts of the UK now considered to be a former Labour heartland. There are 3 constituencies in and around Stoke, and on Thursday night, all of them voted for a Conservative MP. The last time that happened was the early 1930s.
Over to my right is this chap from the BBC. They're interested on what's changed in Stoke and all that.
For the last 15 years, Danny Flynn has been in charge of this YMCA in Hanley, which has helped thousands of young people in the area.
And give someone a shake of the hand or a cuddle of the neck because Stokey's not Stoke, don't you?
He considers himself a Labour voter, but thinks the party has lost its way.
The traditional Labour Party in the north of England and Stoke is working men's club, is trade union, is community. It isn't rabid ideology. Lots of towns in the north of England are army towns. So Stoke's an infantry town. Being proud of the flag, being proud of the Union Jack, being proud of coming from England.
And where does Jeremy Corbyn fit into this?
Well, I think people believe him not to be. They believe him not to be nationalist. They believe him to be anti-Britain. They believe him... I'm not saying he is, because I voted Labour.
That's the perception,
But the perception is, if you go down the Stoke ground and talk about him, he's pro-IRA, he's pro-terrorist.
A key difference for him was how voters in Stoke viewed the contrast between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson.
You know, he's a bit of a blagger and he talks a bit of BS, but he's a bit fun. He's probably a good laugh. And I think they accepted all his buffoonery, as it were, more than Corbyn's ideology.
Until last Thursday, Gareth Snell was the Labour MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. He lost to his Conservative rival by just over 600 votes.
So in Stoke it was a toxic mix of Brexit and the leadership. You know, some people really like Jeremy, and don't get me wrong, there were people who did say to me they were voting Labour for the first time because of Jeremy Corbyn. But there were lots of people who equally said, I simply cannot vote Labour because of Jeremy Corbyn. I spoke to, old trade union officials that simply didn't believe that what he was suggesting were the answers for today's problems. And the Labour Party was absolutely right to point to the fact that universal credit is failing the poorest, that we have food banks, that we have A&E waiting times increases. But those are all negative things. What we actually, I think, forgot to do in some places was talk about all the positives that we already have and how we can build on that.
It's come to a situation now where nobody trusts any politician, and that's why with this Brexit had to be, as far as I could see, Brexit had to be done and out of the way before they could concentrate on the NHS and everything else. And when you get a bloke who's non-committal on Brexit, which he wasn't, Jeremy Corbyn, and a bloke who, for some reason, is intensely disliked by people who don't even understand politics, which he was. I mean, you talk to anybody on the street who thinks Jeremy Corbyn, don't want him leader. And that was the attitude.
I think we'd be better out of Europe than in it. I'm not particularly a great Boris Johnson fan, but I prefer him than Corbyn. No, I definitely wasn't going to vote him. I don't care what party he's in, whether it was in Labour, Lib Dem or whatever. I would never have voted that bloke.
What could Labour do now to win back your vote?
Oh, they'd have to do something really big to win it back, because I've always been Labour and all my family have, and they've all jumped to Conservative.
So do you want to revise your view about what was to blame for Labour's catastrophic defeat? It was Jeremy Corbyn. I don't like Johnson, but I'm certainly not voting for Corbyn.
Well, firstly, I'm completely devastated that Gareth didn't win his seat. I remember campaigning for him in the by-election when he got in. The video was very interesting. What one of the people in the video said was that they wanted to get Brexit out of the way.
And the others said it was about Jeremy Corbyn.
Of course, but I think the things are linked. I think people's view of the leadership was linked to this fact of trust, and they took the view that we hadn't committed to getting Brexit done, and therefore lots of the great bread and butter policies we had, therefore people didn't necessarily believe we could or would deliver them.
Well, it wasn't just Gareth Snell, of course. There were many others who lost their seats, but even the ones who kept their seats and did win on election night, there was a sense of anger and despair at the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting last night. You were there. What was it like?
People were expressing their opinions in a forthright way, as they should, following...
In a forthright way?
Following a disastrous election result. It's important that Labour MPs get together, share their experiences from their constituencies. It's also important that we listen to colleagues who didn't keep the seats and to candidates who we'd have liked to see win and become MPs for the first time who didn't.
What was your view of the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting? I know you weren't actually in the meeting, but you will know what happened.
We're all hanging around outside. It felt like a pressure cooker and the lid had finally come off it. And, this is exactly the sort of phrases that people were saying about Jeremy Corbyn as sort of useless, incredible, shambolic, incoherent. Labour MPs have been saying this about Jeremy Corbyn for 2 years. Not Richard, admittedly, but they all knew this. And I suppose the surprise of this election is everyone appears to be wise after the event, but there seemed to be a moment, I think, in the last 6 to 9 months when Corbyn was having terrible problems over Brexit, that maybe the party could have done something about this, whether flicking over wholeheartedly to Remain, but there was a moment to take on the leader again in enough time before their election. They didn't, they blinked, and it's a harsh thing to say, but it's kind of hard to think they haven't really got anyone else but themselves to blame.
Well, let's take a look at some of the MPs that did speak and what they said. Rachel Reeves, Business Select Committee Chairwoman, launched a withering attack on Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. We've all heard lots of reasons for the election defeat, but the real reason was you. The biggest drag on our vote was you. And the policies you offered were economically illiterate. We need radical change. We need a party and a leader the country can trust. But you don't think Jeremy Corbyn was the problem. Why hasn't he resigned?
Well, Claudia Webb, for example, and Mary Foy made big defences of our manifesto I'm
not talking about the manifesto. I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn and what Rachel Reeves has just said.
But you're quoting what one colleague said.
All right, I'll quote another. I'll quote another. I'll quote another one. Backbencher Clive Efford, and he actually represents the Tribune Group, makes up the bulk of MPs. He shouted at Corbyn that it was clear he was personally toxic to Labour voters. When the boxes were opened in my working class areas on the biggest council estate, they were 50-50 Tory Labour. There's no trust. It's not just you, it's the people around you, and they're trying to fix the succession. If you do, we are just going to do exactly the same thing again. Why haven't the people around Jeremy Corbyn resigned?
Well, Jeremy is standing down.
Yep.
He's going to...
But not until next year, not until March.
He will only be leader for a short time longer.
Should he go now? When you're listening to these sorts of comments, and you heard them obviously last night, we had former Minister Margaret Hodge characterise the meeting as fury, despair, miserable, adding the senior figures around Corbyn were guilty of corporate amnesia in not learning from past hard-left defeats like 1983. I ask you again, why has no one resigned from his team?
It's important to listen to all MPs, but other MPs at the meeting made different points. They're not being quoted on the media. What I would say, however, is that the next general election, unfortunately, is 5 years away. With humility and honesty, we need to look at what went wrong and where it went wrong, where the votes were lost and why they were lost. What we can't do is rush into easy solutions at all, because we've got to make sure we learn the lessons, but learn the right lessons.
Did Jeremy Corbyn make any mistakes?
We all need to take responsibility.
Did Jeremy Corbyn make any mistakes?
I think the mistake that we made was being persuaded as a party that people didn't quite want to get Brexit done as their top priority in the way that many people did. And that's why, the Labour Party, tragically, we lost 60 seats. Of those 60 seats, 50 of them were in Leave areas, and we need to reflect upon that.
Right. But whose fault is that? Sorry, what was the mistake? I didn't understand what you said.
I think the mistake was that the Labour Party made was underestimating just how much people wanted to get Brexit done, underestimating how high that was up their list of political
So
priorities.
are you blaming people who were advocating Remain and a second referendum?
I'm not into a blame game. I know it's better for the kind of drama.
Someone has to be accountable.
I think we all need to take responsibility. I think everyone in the shadow cabinet...
What responsibility are you taking? You were at the forefront of this campaign. You were representing Labour on the doorstep. You yourself have said in an interview that Jeremy Corbyn was a negative on the doorstep for you when you were door knocking. When you say you underestimated...
I said he was raised, as other leaders have been raised as well in the past when I was campaigning for Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband. And, of course, the leadership was raised as an issue, but I think it's intrinsically linked to the issue of Brexit. And that's why, when you look at the seats we lost, of the 60 seats we lost, 50 of them were in Leave areas.
What about the Remain areas? Why did you lose the Remain seats? Why did you lose Stroud to the Tories? They voted Remain.
Well, that's why we need an analysis, because if you look at it, about half of our votes went to Remain parties that we lost. The other half went to Leave parties, but the distribution of those votes geographically and in seats under our electoral system is important as well.
Right,
that's why we need firm analysis of this.
So you lost in all sorts of areas, didn't you?
Yes, and in Scotland we lost votes to the SNP. In northern towns we lost votes to the Brexit Party and to the Conservative Party. In London we lost some votes to the Lib Dems, which meant
so it wasn't
the
just
Tories
about
picked
Brexit.
us.
It wasn't, was it?
But lots of these things are about Brexit and about trust, and the two things...
Well, we'll come to the Brexit policy in a moment, because you obviously agreed and signed up to the Brexit policy.
I mean, I just think it's crazy to sit there and still hold the line that Brexit was the main issue and that was the reason that people didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. It wasn't. I went round many of the northern seats which turned Tory, and people were saying they were bringing up the IRA, they were bringing up his association with terrorists, and you would say, and I would agree actually, that there was a concerted campaign from the right-wing media, and I would include The Sun in that, to demonise Jeremy Corbyn. But that was the reality of the situation. He was completely toxic.
You mean he demonised himself?
But well, yeah, you could say that. But there was, or for example, the Sunday Times, every week in the money section, it was like, what are you going to do to guard your money from Jeremy Corbyn? Every section of the media was trying to scare people, out against voting Jeremy Corbyn. But he'd made so many mistakes. He had a left luggage office of baggage, and you just couldn't get past that.
He was toxic.
He was raised on the doorstep.
He was toxic, Richard. We've just heard it from all sorts of different quarters.
Helen's right in that inevitably the right-wing press, like The Sun and the Daily Mail, did try and carry out a character assassination. But I expect that. If you've got a socialist programme, if you're anti-establishment, the establishment media...
No, but we're not talking about the programme. We can talk about the programme. We're talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Was Jeremy Corbyn toxic on the doorstep? Having heard everything in the film from Stoke, on the comments that have been made by your MPs and former MPs who lost their seats, and by Helen, who was also out in the campaign, was he toxic or wasn't he?
If people accept, or people are accepting that the reason we lost 2.5 million votes in 2019 was Jeremy Corbyn, then they should also accept that the reason we gained 3 million votes in 2017 was because of him, but they don't take that view at all.
Well, no, because we're talking about the 2019 election, Richard.
I think...
And you lost both elections.
I think it's a complete simplification to try and apportion responsibility on a single individual or personality. That's my view.
All right. Well, let's show you this opinion poll that has been done. Voters were asked for the reasons why they didn't vote Labour. 43% said it was the leadership. 17%, the reason you keep giving, was Brexit stance, and 12% the economic policies. So I ask you again, was the problem the leadership in this election?
I'm afraid I'm not going to give you the answer that you want.
It's not the answer I want. I'm just saying, look at the evidence. The evidence suggests it.
I believe that the issue of Brexit and the issue of people's perception of the leadership were linked. But at the same time, of course, the Sun newspaper, of course, they were writing false things. I mean, I had to take Tom and his newspaper to court when they said something dreadful about me. They lost in court and we won. If Jeremy had had the chance to take some of these newspapers to court, I'm sure he'd have got a similar result.
So, just to remember, Jeremy Corbyn did or didn't invite Jeremy Adams into the House of Commons 4 days after the Brighton bombing?
Your newspaper,
that's just a question.
Your newspaper has not only demonised people in Liverpool disgracefully, has not only demonised ex-striking
But Richard,
miners.
answer the question.
Your newspaper has also indulged in dog whistle racism, and yes, tried to carry out a character assassination.
Want to answer that question?
Tried to carry out a character assassination on Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who cares far more about working class people than you and the people who.
But none of them.
So, do you want to answer that question? Did he or didn't he bring Jeremy Adams into the House of Commons 4 days after the Brighton bombing?
These things have been responded to by Jeremy.
You did, thank you.
Remember that the Sun newspaper, for example, I took you to court and you lost after saying dreadful things about me. I'm sure that Jeremy could have done the same as well. But when it comes to it, it's not just the media. We expect the right-wing media to be hostile about us. I think that the issue of Brexit and the policy we adopted, it was right to try and bring people together. I admit it. It failed, and I think that meant that people didn't necessarily trust us as a Labour Party because they thought we were going to get Brexit done and they're frustrated we haven't.
Well, we're going to talk about the Brexit policy in a moment, but let's listen to what the former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair said.
The takeover of the Labour Party by the far left turned it into a glorified protest movement with cult trimmings, utterly incapable of being a credible government. The result has brought shame on us. We let our country down. To go into an election at any time with such a divergence between party and people is unacceptable. To do it at a time of national crisis, when a credible opposition is so essential to the national interest, is unforgivable.
Richard?
Well, of course, I'm always interested in hearing from Tony Blair. I was a member of the Labour Party campaigning for Tony Blair to become Prime Minister. I do think it's an oversimplification, though. He's talking about the hard left. Does he really believe?
It's you. He's talking about you.
Does he really believe that Emily Thornberry, Keir Starmer, Barry Gardiner are the hard left? I mean, that's just completely incorrect.
What about you?
Well, I don't think that hard left is a pejorative term. I'm a socialist from the left of the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is a broad church and should be. But I do think we need to reflect on why we lost 2.5 million votes in the same way as we needed to reflect why, between 1997 and 2010, Labour lost 5 million votes after supporting policies of cuts and policies of war.
But they won 3 elections.
They did, but by the end, we'd lost 5 million votes. We need to get those votes back.
Right, and this is the 4th defeat for Labour, isn't it, since
Yes,
2010? Let's talk about Brexit, because you've mentioned it so many times. Did you think it was a good idea to go into the election facing both ways on the issue of Brexit, the single most important issue, arguably, of this election?
I think it was right to try and bring people together. We're a party that represents communities that voted Leave and Remain. It was morally the right thing to do. It felt at the time politically the right thing to do, but it failed. It didn't work because I think the Labour Party underestimated how high up people's priority list.
And you thought it was a good idea and it failed, so you must take responsibility for that.
I think we all must take responsibility. The whole shadow cabinet must take responsibility for it.
Right, so do you agree? So do you agree with Emily Thornberry? She said she raised this at the shadow cabinet, but the loudest voices were the pro-Leave colleagues, who first of all insisted that we should go for an election in the first place. Was that you?
Well, an election was going to happen. The choice before us was a general election was going to happen. You either go into the ring with the Tories up for the fight, or you get dragged into the ring, and that doesn't end well.
Did she, as she has said, warn it would be an act of catastrophic political folly to vote for the election?
Well, I'm not going to breach the confidentiality of shadow cabinet meetings and say what Emily did or didn't say.
Well, no, she said that. She said that's what she did.
Well,
she said to the leader's office it was an act of catastrophic political folly to vote for the election. Was she right?
I don't think she is right on that. However, what I would say is that our policy, it was the right thing to do to attempt to bring people together. However, it failed. But there's no easy solution on this question of Brexit. Others were counselling we became more Remain. Look what happened to the Lib Dems. Their leader lost.
But as we've just established, you lost seats in both Remain areas and Leave areas. So I say to you again, you personally argued for a policy promising a second referendum and then not picking a side.
We thought the correct policy to take was to try and bring people together with a credible Leave option and Remain and implement the result of that. We lost 60 seats. It's a tragedy. Of those 60 seats, 50 were in Leave areas. So by adopting going forward a more Remain position isn't the way forward. What we need to do is reflect, understand that Brexit is going to happen on the 31st of January and start trying to push forward an economic and social agenda which serves both people who voted Leave and Remain.
All right, well, let's listen to what Keir Starmer had to say. He's expected to run for the leadership too. He obviously argued in favour of a second referendum and has always said that he would argue forcefully for Remain. Let's hear.
What resonated on the doors was this phrase, "Get Brexit done." And we did not knock that flat. And we should have done. And I would have liked the chance to have knocked it flat.
Why was he hidden? Why was he hidden during the campaign? He didn't have the chance to take the Tories on over Brexit. You were there, but why wasn't he?
Well, that's a question that needs to be addressed to him, for example.
Well, no, he wouldn't have made the decision to hide himself away, would he?
I would say this, whenever I was asked to step up to the plate and do media as part of the team effort, I did it, because I think in a general election campaign, we need to come up front, we need to muck in, we need to work together. That's what Team Labour's about.
Was it a mistake not to have Keir Starmer? We were told all the way through the campaign that people like him and Emily Thornberry were hidden away to allow pro-Leave candidates like yourself and even Lavery to step up.
I think that Labour has a plurality of voices, and all were important in the general election, from Keir to Emily, to myself, Rebecca Long-Bailey and Angela Rayner, who did leaders' debates. I think it's important that all the different voices from the Labour movement are heard. Right.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, you are backing her then as the candidate, and she is seen as the continuity Corbyn candidate. That's right.
I think that's an oversimplification. She is from the left of the party. But I believe with the brief she's had of climate change and industry and jobs, I think she can help, and she's from the north, of course. I think she understands why we lost votes in Leave areas, understands the industrial programme as part of the Green Industrial Revolution, which can actually help those towns, help to replace the jobs lost as a result of deindustrialisation.
And you are considering running as deputy to someone like Rebecca Long-Bailey?
I'm considering us running as deputy leader of the Labour Party, because I think it's important that whoever is leader, that on both the leadership ballot and on the deputy leadership ballot, we have somebody from the left of the Labour Party, I'm secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group, who endorsed and nominated Jeremy in the first leadership election.
So you're going to have two. You could have a leadership candidate in Rebecca Long-Bailey and you as the prospective deputy, both as Corbyn continuity candidates.
I think that's an oversimplification. We were both and are.
All right, the same wings of the party.
Big supporters of Jeremy. I think it's important that members have a choice in both the leadership ballot and the deputy leadership ballot of people from all parts of the Labour's political family. That's really important, because if we're going to bring our party together, that's what we need. So the Labour Party's always been a coalition of socialists, trade unionists, social democrats.
I mean, the definition of madness is to keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. I struggle to see what you've taken from this devastating defeat that makes you think, oh, Britain wants a left, quite far left government. I don't see how you've made that calculation at all.
I think the policies that we were pursuing, such as a £10 an hour minimum wage, such as free childcare of 30 hours a week for the parents of 2 to 4-year-olds, such as the Green Industrial Revolution, creating skilled manufacturing jobs to replace those lost in stature. All of these policies, those policies weren't criticised on the doorstep. And I think after 5 years of a Conservative government, the urgent need for those policies will become more and more apparent. It's not about doing the same thing. It's about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We need to learn the lessons and be humble, but we can't throw out our anti-austerity politics, our pro-investment politics, our anti-racist politics.
Richard, you keep on saying you want to be humble, you want to learn the lessons. There isn't a single criticism you're able to make of the leadership or Jeremy Corbyn that doesn't involve the right-wing press, some sort of terrible conspiracy theory, or the Remainers
in your
conspiracy theory, or the Remainers in your party. But one targeted question for you: are you aware of #BackBurgon on Twitter, which is a silly little thing, but the Tories, they have a candidate in this leadership contest as well. It's you.
Well, Twitter...
They really want you to win.
It's called Tories.
Can you reflect on that? Why might that be?
Twitter's a funny place, and I must disappoint you. I do have a sense of humour, but in terms of...
well, that's not disappointing that you've got a sense of humour.
But in terms of going forward, I think the Labour Party... Shadow Cabinet needs to take collective responsibility for the fact that we underestimated people's desire to get Brexit. But
it wasn't just an underestimate. It's the worst performance for the Labour Party in terms of numbers of seats since 1935.
Yes, and it's the distribution of votes, and we need to analyse that. We got more votes than we did, for example, in 2005. However, it was a tragic result for the people we represent.
Who would you like to see as the next Labour leader?
Well, I should say this is actually a very sad state of affairs for the Labour Party.
But are you backing Richard Burgon?
Well, I think there's something in the #Tories for Burgon that is interesting for all of us to think about.